Yeah, I grew up in Waconia, and I graduated high school in 2007. 9/11 happened when I was in 7th grade, and that was a pretty big catalyst in sparking me an interest in following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan really closely. So I was kind of immersed in that all throughout the rest of middle school and all of high school, and I knew that, I was kind of destined for something different than the ordinary college and career track. And despite being a 4.0 student, I still wanted to, enlist in the Marine Corps. I was really attracted to, the challenge, the travel, the adventure, I guess all the naturally virtuous stuff, like patriotism, and also ultimately I had a desire to participate in what I'd been reading about. So I ended up actually going to college for a year after high school to ensure that that decision was mature and thought out, and that was an agreement I had with my parents. And yeah, so I enlisted when I was 19, and ended up a couple years later attached to a kind of a legendary deployment, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. My job was a forward observer in the Marine Corps, so I was in charge and responsible for calling in and coordinating safely and effectively all of the military's fire support assets. So I was like the eyes on the ground in the infantry, in charge of like artillery, HIMAR rockets, mortars, and even naval gunfire, and then most prominently air support.
Okay.
So from helicopters and jets. And yeah, I got injured in Afghanistan. I stepped on a landmine on October 15th, 2010, and very lucky to be alive. That whole day is a story in of itself, but
I bet.
Ultimately did 2 years of rehabilitation, roughly, let's see, probably 9 to 10 months of like hospital, inpatient, outpatient immediately following my injury, like 50 surgeries. A lot of them were to save this leg. Yeah, so I finished physical therapy, occupational therapy, all that stuff. I got discharged from the Marine Corps after 2 years, a 2-year process, and I, moved back up here. Up to this point in my life, I had always been a lukewarm Lutheran Christian. That's how I characterize my faith. It was very superficial and shallow, and entered into kind of like a dark, depressive stage after that discharge from the Marine Corps, feeling a little isolated up here. First time detached from like Marine Corps friends and buddies that suffered very similar injuries that I did rehab with. Really struggled to find a new direction in life, like meaning, a purpose, something that I was passionate about, that I wanted to pursue, because all my favorite things in life were essentially taken away with, my injury. So I attribute a lot of that kind of dark phase to that kind of struggle to find purpose.
Yeah.
And slowly time healed and brought me out of that, and I met my wife a couple of years after that too, and that helped me a lot.
Yeah.
And got married to my wife. She's a cradle Catholic, and I was still a Lutheran at the time, but we got married inside of the Catholic Church. And 1 year after that, I had a pretty profound conversion experience, and ever since then, aside from being a husband and a father, I want to spend the rest of my life, serving the church, and as a married layman, that'll probably be some sort of teaching role. And so I got a master's degree in theology, and I just got recently hired at St. Thomas Academy High School teaching theology. Yeah, sure. So I got married to my wife. This about 6 years after my injury. I got married to my wife, and we got married in the Catholic Church, like I had said. And a year after that, I was up in bed one night really late, at like 2 a.m., waiting for my wife to come home. She was a nurse working a night shift at the Masonic Children's Hospital.
Oh, okay.
And just completely unprovoked, unmerited on my part, of course, and this, again, is consistent with the way God works. Like, all the grace and blessings that He bestows are completely out of His generosity and His, liberality. It's nothing that we do deserve or prompt it, but we can cooperate with it.
Yeah.
So nothing on my part really led up to this really random moment, but it was a really intense kind of spiritual experience that smacked me, caught me totally off guard in the best way that I can articulate it. And again, it's very hard to articulate this experience, because if you read a lot of the spiritual writers, like, they kind of struggle with the same thing. But I could essentially see the state of my soul like crystal clearly. Like I could see like what I was doing wrong, what I needed to do, what my errors were in the past. I could see my own kind of hypocrisy, all these years of professing faith, but having that not really integrate into a meaningful part of, you know, how you live your life, or what you value, or what you pursue, or the decisions you make. It was all, again, very superficial faith and nothing that really translated into the will. And yeah, so that's kind of the best way I can describe this experience, but it, you know, inflamed, set kind of my heart, my soul on fire, and all of a sudden kind of I had direction, I knew what I needed to do. Yeah, so that kind of just lit that fire, and from then on I just rigorously, over the next month, pursued where the, you know, fullness of truth resides. And at that time I was investigating all the different Protestant denominations,
Yep.
and of course the Catholic Church as well, knowing that, you know, I got married in the Catholic Church, and
Yeah.
I was open to it, right? So thankfully I didn't really have a lot of emotional connection
Yeah.
to my Lutheran, you know, upbringing, which benefited me greatly in that I really took a hard, objective look at everything.
Yep.
And it didn't take long at all to study my way into the Catholic Church. You know, that's where the fullness of Christian revelation resides. Christ founded a church, and there's specific theological arguments and a process by which I kind of came to that conclusion. If you want to know more about that, I can elaborate on that. But ultimately, I studied my way into the Catholic Church. One of the interesting stories during that month of studying, and again, I just read like nearly 100 books, like podcasts, video, like everything you can imagine, apologetics. But a really interesting part of that 1 month period was everything I'd read, like St. Padre Pio's name kept popping up everywhere. And again, I was kind of an ignorant, naive, I wasn't even Catholic yet, so like I'd never been exposed to a saint or a biographical work of a saint. And as someone that studies theology, you know, kind of for a living now,
Yeah.
His name never pops up in the way that it did. Like, it's just totally bizarre. So it got to a point where I wanted to learn more about him. I didn't know who he was. I bought the most popular biographical work about St. Padre Pio, read his book, and I was just blown away. It was the first saint book I had ever read. And of course, Padre Pio was, you know, blessed with the stigmata and all these mystical, charismatic, extraordinary gifts. But the thing that like really stood out to me was that really introduced me to the church's theology of suffering, and like his posture towards suffering, and how, I mean, in a unique way, that was kind of his vocation, and that suffering is transformed into something salvific, and it just opened all these doors, because it transforms the whole posture of, you know, by which you approach life, and you endure, you know, trials and afflictions, all sorts of sufferings. And of course that resonated with me, with everything I had gone through. So that really, you know, really encouraged me. Like literally right after that book, I made an appointment with Father Bob White in St. Victoria. He's the one who married my wife and I. And so I met with him, I got there, and before I could even communicate that I wanted to become a Catholic, and before I could elaborate on the whole process it took for me to get here, the first thing he does is he invites me on a pilgrimage that St. Victoria was taking to La Crosse, Wisconsin, to visit and venerate the relics of St. Padre Pio, which were coming to America like for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of like a cherry on top, like, you know, maybe like a little spiritual sign that, you know, maybe St. Padre Pio had a prominent role maybe as an intercessor in that 1 month process, and also he had a really strong kind of devotion to U.S. troops during World War II. A lot of U.S. troops would actually, in Italy, because he's a friar in Italy, they'd make pilgrimages to go see them by like the hundreds of thousands. And then in his spiritual letters, he would always say if there's any like American soldier that would, you know, beseech me as like a spiritual father, you know, that sort of thing, that he wouldn't hesitate, that he would do it.
Oh, amazing.
So anyways, from that moment on, you know, I fell in love with the Catholic faith, fell in love with philosophy and theology, and came into the church in 2017, and immediately kind of transferred to this parish because we live right down the road, and Father Tony O'Neill was very instrumental in that process too. So, well, I think it kind of all begins with an honest examination kind of your conscience, an honest, objective self-inventory where you kind of identify your weaknesses, your disorderly attachments, things that are like obstacles to pursuing a greater, deeper relationship with God. So that's going to look different for every person. But for me, I mean, you take these things seriously. You want to become more holy. You want to become more virtuous. You know, I want to eliminate bad habits, which are vices. And that, you know, you work that stuff out over a lifetime, right? Like,
Yeah.
you work out your salvation with fear and trembling over a lifetime. It's from the New Testament. So, yeah, for me, first, you know, I kind of did that. I knew what I wanted to work on militating against in terms of, like, my own character flaws and everything. And then stay close to the sacraments. You know, the sacrament of confession is a fountain of mercy and grace. Like, God desires to, you know, heal you through that sacrament, along with, of course, the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass and the Eucharist and adoration. So, I mean, but at the center of all of it, it's just a robust prayer life, right? Like, that's kind of the foundation that needs to be set. And what an appropriate prayer life would look like is, of course, dependent on your state in life, your vocation. You know, of course, like Father Peter is called to a lot more prayer than, you know, people called to the vocation of marriage, and especially, you know, people like myself with young kids. It's been a struggle to adapt, you know, to, like, again, change your routine and find an appropriate amount of prayer a day and fitting that into your schedule. But yeah, making that leap to actually living out your faith, it takes humility, it takes fortitude, it takes a real, like, authentic faith, right? Like, it's not just, again, just not that intellectual thing, but it's something you want to conform your whole life around, because there really is nothing. If God exists in, like, the Christian faith, and Christ is just, you know, true God, true man, if all this stuff is true, then there's, like, literally nothing that's more important about reality and existence. And it's like, why would you not, like, submit yourself to that and, like, conform your life around that truth, right? So, I mean, yeah, it's not like you go 0 to 100 and all of a sudden you're a saint, but I guess for me it was just I took this seriously. I mean, I still have a long way to go, of course, like everybody does, but you take it seriously, you kind of find that courage to actually live it out publicly. Yeah, I don't know, prayer, sacraments, study. Again, study kind of helps nourish and facilitate that spiritual life. I think it's so tough today to, you know, be silent and, like, find that time for a whole array of reasons. Number one, like, that's totally antithetical to everything that's kind of promoted in, like, our current culture, right? It's just constant noise, constant distraction, you know, the phones, the TV, music. I mean, there's just massive amounts of resistance where it takes a really strong, concerted effort of the will to actually, again, like, force yourself to have this time where the TV's, you know, off, the phone is off, you know, it's silent, you have time to yourself. And I think that's where, I mean, spiritual lives, like, and prayer lives, like, really need to grow. So it takes that discipline too, right? So it's not only that's what we're, like, inclined towards as, like, our modern society and culture, but it takes a very heroic act of the will to even, you know, set that time aside, follow through on it, and, like, establish that habit. Yeah, it's a very tough thing because you're very vulnerable, right? But, you know, ultimately you're shooting towards, like, this total abandonment to God and trusting in His providence. And I don't know, what was the question?
Being uncomfortable.
Like, getting outside your comfort zone? Well, actually, you know what, I can speak to that a little. I mean, I'm not an expert in that stuff, but I have lived to extent. I had to grapple with that early on too, because Father Tony, when I was a brand new Catholic, I have this really unique, captivating story of, like, you know, my service and getting injured, and how that, you know, was maybe a catalyst for my conversion, a tremendous amount of suffering, even more good coming out of that than bad, you know, like, just this big story. And I've always been very introverted, like, I hate the spotlight. I would never ordinarily, like, agree to this stuff, but Father Tony was the one that kind of finally helped me connect something in that, like, God has given me kind of the second shot at life, and I attribute, of course, my conversion to the working of God through grace. All these different things that God has done for me that are so wonderful, and, like, it would be more fitting that I share that, and rather than just, like, keep it bottled up, right? Because me sharing that, while it's uncomfortable for myself, like, it can bear great fruit in other souls, and, like, help other souls come to know and love and, you know, serve God, and, like, especially with my kind of unique story that maybe resonates a little more with people, in that like I didn't grow up Catholic, and you know, I've done these things in life, and you know, now I'm here, and like there's a natural interest in like how people would, there's a natural interest in that people would want to know like how I made that leap, like from hotshot Marine to you know, on fire Catholic. So anyways, it was a big struggle for me at first to start speaking to parishes and confirmation groups and parish events, and of course Father Tony through the Companions of Christ. I got kind of plugged into that network and all the pastors had me speak there. And ever since 2018, I've been given many talks to large groups, you know, every year, including students that I was with in the graduate degree program at the seminary. Like they're all like faith formation coordinators and directors of stuff at parishes, and so anyways, thankfully, you know, I've been able to, I guess, retain some element of humility in that, and like I don't really enjoy like the esteem of others.
You're not
and,
doing
you know,
it
I'm not doing
your
it for
own
the
self.
bad, you know, illicit like self ends, but like I generally have this passion to serve the church again, right? To help people discover these amazing truths and live to be happy, and to, you know, find God and conform their life around God and show them the Catholic Church, the intellectual beauty and the richness, all these different things, right? But I know that that entailed a certain amount of uncomfortability for me, and I found to take joy in it, actually. Like I don't hesitate now to just say yes to everything, even though like it's not my favorite thing to do, right? So so the root of everything is family, parents, you know. That's the genesis, that's the nuclear, you know, unit there for society. So parents have to do a really good job at, you know, even if they're not, you know, theologians or anything, but, you know, they have to set the example that they live their faith, you know, take it seriously, and then also communicate like the whys. I think that's one of the big failures, at least in like the baby boomer generation and everything, is like, again, their parents, you know, maybe you go to mass every Sunday and like on holy days and stuff like that, but when you were taught, you know, this whole laundry list of sins and like, you know, all that stuff, but like there was never really any concerted effort to like dig deeper than that, like why. And that's something that me as a new high school teacher to kids, I just talked about Commandments 6 and 9, which you kind of embody the whole body of the church's teaching on human sexuality. So like I covered all these things, but it wasn't just me like saying this is a grave matter sin, this is wrong, this is disordered, but to really show like this really rich intellectual foundation underlying all of it, and really firmly communicating over and over and over again that the church isn't like prescribing these things and condemning these things to be a buzzkill and to be oppressive and to be like
there's a reason.
Unnecessarily intrusive, but this is the way to flourish and to be happy and to have meaningful relationships. And like that message, I think, was just really, really missed by a couple generations of people. And I don't know, it's really easy for, you know, your faith to grow cold if you just you know,
just come on Sunday.
If you don't, right, like that obligation type of faith rather than the living and I don't know. Love is like true love is like wanting to share. You want to share the truth with this person because it's true and like it's for their good, right? Love is concerned with the good of the other. So like for example, like the Eucharist. Like it's so easy to water down teachings about the Eucharist, but like that's the greatest gift that our church has, you know. It's the real presence of Christ that you can go see in adoration, and you know, it's offered in the sacrifice of the Mass and then received in Holy Communion. Like the true love would be desiring another person experiencing that, you know. So it's like, why would you water that down? Two different kind of views that are presented in society, this tension between views of marriage, like the relational romantic view of marriage versus the conjugal view of marriage. And like, again, everything you see on TV and what's propagated everywhere is like this relational romantic view of marriage. Not to say those things aren't great in like real marriage, but like that's not the essence of marriage. It's like once you lose like romantic feelings, you know, that doesn't mean you don't love the person, right? Or like that honeymoon phase, like that sort of thing. That's why you see so many divorces and everything. It's like people think
grew apart.
But I mean, real love is like one ordered towards like procreation and a family, but two, it's like self-sacrificial, right? Like the measure of love is always kind of determined by sacrifice, as most perfectly exemplified in a supreme way by Christ on the cross, right?
Totally.
And that's actually the analogy that St. Paul gives for marriage when he speaks about that in like Ephesians. And again, this is a huge fundamental difference actually between a lot of Protestant denominations and Catholics, is like we'll view the passion as like Christ willed this, like he consented to this, he chose this, and it's an act of love for us because he's willing to, you know, take away our bondage to sin and death, and like open up the way for us to participate in supernatural divine life. Like that's what heaven is. It's beatitude, participating in the divine inner life of the Trinity. So anyways, we view like the whole passion, all of the afflictions that Christ endured in the passion, which wasn't just physical, but it was spiritual, you know, the agony in the garden, like psychological. Whereas a lot of Protestants will view like the whole act of redemption under what's called penal substitution, where like God, the Father, was punishing Christ. There was no free will, it wasn't an act of love, but he substituted like our out of justice, like what we are deserved of for all of our sins was made up for by Christ, and God the Father decided to punish Christ in our place. Like, it's like a it's like a pure like magistrate in court sort of transaction rather than something deeper, which has always been the understanding of.
Well, I mean,
which again kind of speaks to the theology of suffering, and that like we get to participate in that same cross and suffering of Christ in our own unique ways. Like when St. Paul speaks of he's suffering for the sake of the body, which is the church, for the afflictions that we're lacking in the sufferings of Christ, which is us, like the church. Like we're extensions of that, and like the whole spiritual life is ordered towards like configuration and conformity to Christ, and that also means his cross. You know, Matthew 16:24 is it, or something like that. You know, if you wish to follow me, take up your cross daily and follow me. Or if you wish to be my disciple, take up your cross daily and follow me. So like it really consecrates our own sufferings in life to have something bearing salvific value, and like their opportunities, which is so striking if you read any book about the lives of the saints. Like they come to actually like treasure and value the sufferings and affliction that God sends them more than anything. That doesn't mean like they're not suffering, like there's a real discomfort and pain or whatever type of pain, but like there coexists this deep joy and peace, and again knowing that there's purpose and value behind them, and like them undergoing those with that type of prayerful disposition and offering up, uniting it to Christ, is there literally is nothing more valuable. And it's actually one of the things that like angels are envious of human beings for two reasons. Primary reasons. One of them is the Eucharist, like we get to be uniquely united to Christ through the Eucharist, but also that we have bodies and that we're embodied and that we can suffer for the sake, which again, it sounds totally backwards, but only in, with, and through Christ does that actually make sense. And that, again, that's so much, it's incredible. It's easy to like conceptualize, but it's really hard to live out when you're actually suffering. And my answer is probably the answer that is really common, but I think it's true and very meaningful and harder to live out. But it's ultimately just living as an example, right? Like that's the most unburdensome, unimposing thing that, someone that needs that type of guidance in their life, they can just see you and like recognize that there's something different like about this person. Like this is a man of character or a woman of character and virtue, and again, all these different qualities that are indicative of like a deep, spiritual life, a prayer life. And I think people, at least I've found that people will naturally kind of gravitate towards you. Like there is a beauty in that, and that like it speaks even maybe subconsciously to, again, that hunger that people have for that. So once they see it, they recognize it, again, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously, and they'll gravitate towards those people. And then there'll be a certain comfortability too, in that, again, it's not like you grab a Bible on a street corner and start preaching to people. Like this is something that's lived, and people will, I think, definitely take note of like the good life that you're living, more so than you're even cognizant of. And at least in my life, that's what's kind of happened with me. Like I never try to I guess intrude on other people's lives. I never try to interject unnecessarily, but I also try to be very like prudent about sharing this and like recognize opportunities, like maybe where it would be appropriate for me to I don't know, spark some sort of conversation
Right.
where it would lead to these sort of issues. Of course, family relationships are really delicate, and again, there's a lot of prudence that needs to be employed there. But I've just found that, yeah, people will recognize the transformation of life, especially coming from someone like me, or like a real conversion story where you had this old way of living and then you're totally reoriented and you're, you know,
Yeah.
you're a changed person. And it's impossible to not see and observe that. So yeah, in my family and friends, there's just a certain openness that everybody has with me specifically, and I've never, again, been imposing or anything. Like, that's, if anything, I should be more imposing, I think. Like, maybe there are more opportunities that I should proactively pursue. But I've just been kind of blown away by even people at the parish. Like, when I was new at the parish, there's just so many people coming to me and asking questions, not only about theology, but just even about, like, spiritual life, or just their own kind of journey and spiritual life. And yeah, I don't know if that's something unique about me, but everything I've read and, you know, all the people I've talked to, they kind of have similar experiences where, yeah, people want that.
Yeah.
And they'll come to you and they'll ask you when you're ready. And yeah, a lot of this is just drawn out naturally in conversation with people.
Yeah. And showing them that
you care, you love, like you're actually invested in them. This isn't like a intellectual, like, pugil match where you're trying to, like, you know, it's not like some intellectual, like politics. It's not like politics.
Right. Thank God.
It's more like, by living that life, like, you're communicating like that Christian love, right? That self-disinterested love, like you really care and are genuinely invested in their well-being and their flourishing, right? And yeah, just that you care, that there's no, like, ulterior motive.
Yeah.